The elevator doors on the 38th floor opened at 5:47 in the morning, and Terrence Mack stepped out alone, the way he always did, before the building remembered it was supposed to be occupied. He pushed the cleaning cart slowly down the corridor, one wheel dragging slightly because he had put off filing the maintenance request again. The same way he put off a lot of things that were only problems for himself. His jacket was zipped to the collar against the air conditioning that ran too cold even in October, and tucked into his front pocket was a folded piece of paper with Josie's spelling words for Thursday's test. Because she had fallen asleep before they finished the last four, and he had promised her they would do them in the car. Except there was no car ride this morning. His sister had taken Josie overnight because the boiler in Terrence's apartment building had gone out again, and a 7-year-old could not sleep in a place that cold, even under 2 blankets. So the spelling words sat in his pocket unused, and the hallway stretched ahead of him empty and fluorescent, and somewhere on the other side of the glass wall at the end of the corridor, Hargrove Medical Group was preparing to sell itself to people who had already decided what it was worth. Terrence had worked the early shift at Hargrove for 4 years, long enough to know which executives came in with coffee and which ones came in already angry. Long enough to know that the legal team's presence at 6 in the morning meant something that never ended well for the people on lower floors. Long enough to know, without being told, that the cluster of suits gathered now in the executive conference room were not there to celebrate anything. He moved past the glass wall without slowing. It was not his floor in the way that mattered. He was there to empty bins and wipe surfaces and become invisible in the way that buildings required of certain people. Through the glass, he could see them clearly enough. 6 people around the long table, and at the head, a woman named Sandra Vaught, who had been Hargrove's CEO for 11 years, and had the kind of stillness that came not from calm, but from someone who had learned to hold grief professionally. Across from her sat 2 men Terrence did not recognize in dark jackets that read money from 20 feet away. Between them, a folder thick enough to matter. Terrence did not stop, but then something slid from the edge of the conference table as one of the unfamiliar men shifted his weight. A single printed page that caught the draft from the door and drifted past the narrow gap at the threshold, landing half open near the baseboard just outside the room. Terrence looked at it the way you look at something that falls without meaning to, without intention. He bent to pick it up, intending only to leave it on the nearest surface so someone could retrieve it. But one line stopped him cold. Not a sentence, a number, a figure in the column labeled Net Asset Valuation. Current period, which sat beside another figure in the column labeled Prior Period Adjusted, and the gap between them was wrong in a way that Terrence felt before he could name it. Not because he was certain, because the number looked like a number that had been touched. He stared at it longer than he should have. Inside the conference room, Sandra Vaught uncapped her pen. Terrence had not planned to say anything. He was still telling himself that when his hand touched the conference room door, the sound was quiet, the faintest knock against the glass. But 6 heads turned with the speed of people who had not expected anything to exist beyond their own conversation. The silence that followed was the specific kind that powerful people used as a weapon. Terrence stepped halfway through the door, one hand still on the frame, the cart still in the hallway behind him. Sandra Vaught looked at him. Her expression was not unkind, but it was not open either. It was the face of someone calculating whether a small interruption would cost them time they didn't have. One of the suited men, the one on the left whose name Terrence didn't know yet, exhaled sharply through his nose. "This is a closed session," he said. Not to Terrence, exactly. More to the room, as if the fact of Terrence's presence were an administrative oversight rather than a person. Terrence's heart was moving faster than he wanted it to. He was aware of the cleaning gloves on his hands, aware of the logo on his jacket, aware of exactly how the room was reading him and what conclusion they had already reached. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said. "There's a page that came out from under the door. I picked it up." He held it toward the room. "I think there might be an error on it." The other suited man, younger, with a jaw like something architectural, gave a short laugh. "An error, the asset valuation column." Terrence kept his voice even, though keeping it even required more effort than it should have. "The current period figure doesn't match what the prior period adjustment would imply. If your facility's acquisition schedule ran through Q3, this number should be tracking higher, not lower." Nobody spoke. Sandra Vaught had not laughed. She had gone very still in the way that meant she was listening at a level below the surface. The first suited man, Terrence would learn later his name was Philip Crane, acquisition lead for Meridian Health Partners, leaned back in his chair with the patience of someone who had sat in many rooms where people tried to appear more than they were. "You mop floors," he said. "Yes," Terrence said. He did not add anything to that because there was nothing to add that would not sound defensive. Then I think we can handle the arithmetic, Crane said. Sandra Vaught set down her pen. Show me. Crane turned toward her with the visible irritation of a man who had not expected pushback from that direction. Sandra, show me, she said again to Terrence. Terrence walked to the table. He was conscious of every step. He placed the page flat and pointed to the two figures without touching them. Your Q3 acquisition of the Belmore Outpatient Center. If that posted before the period close, your net asset base increases before depreciation runs. But this figure reflects a lower asset base than even last year's audited number. It moved in the wrong direction. Sandra leaned forward. Crane spoke with controlled precision. Depreciation offsets can compress the visible net, not by this much. The second suited man had spoken, not Crane. The younger one, whose name was apparently important enough that he had a separate folder. He was staring at the number now. Not if Belmore was arm's-length acquisition value. Crane's expression shifted slightly, just slightly. But Terrence noticed it the way you notice a chip in something that was supposed to be solid. Sandra looked at the analyst seated at the far end of the table, a woman named Reese who had been quiet through all of this. Pull the Belmore acquisition posting date and run this against the period-end snapshot. Crane set both palms flat on the table. We don't have time to revisit line items on the word of a Reese, Sandra said, not raising her voice, only removing everything from it except instruction. Reese opened her laptop. The room waited. Terrence stood near the wall, not sure what a person in his position was supposed to do with his hands. Reese's typing stopped before anyone expected it to. The Belmore acquisition posted September 28th, she said. That's inside the Q3 window, Crane said nothing. If it posted inside Q3, the asset base should reflect it before impairment. Reese scrolled. It doesn't. The net figure here is pulling from the pre-acquisition snapshot. She looked up. The model is running against the wrong baseline. Sandra's voice was completely steady. By how much? Reese typed again. The number that appeared on her screen made the younger acquisition man sit back slowly, like a person absorbing a physical impact. 31 million, Reese said. Hargrove's net asset position is understated by at least $31 million. Crane's jaw set. That's within rounding variance for an estate of this size. The younger man turned toward him. Philip, 31 million is not rounding variance. Run the liability schedule against the corrected baseline, Sandra said. She had not moved, but the quality of her stillness had changed into something active. Reese ran it, then stopped again, then ran something adjacent. Terrence could see from the angle of her screen that the numbers were changing direction. If the asset base is corrected, Reese said carefully, voice pitched lower now, Hargrove's debt-to-asset ratio drops below the threshold Meridian used to establish distressed valuation. Nobody spoke. You're not distressed, the younger man said slowly, as if the sentence was arriving from somewhere distant. Sandra looked at the unsigned acquisition agreement in front of her, the document that Meridian Health Partners had presented as the only viable path forward for a hospital system they had spent 6 months telling her was running out of road. She looked at Terrence. How did you see that? She asked. Terrence hesitated. The number didn't belong where it was sitting, he said. Once you've looked at enough models, wrong numbers have a shape. Crane stood. This is not how due diligence works. We have a team of credentialed analysts who built this valuation over 4 months. We are not restructuring a 9-figure acquisition around. He stopped himself, but the sentence had already made its shape clear. Around what? Sandra asked. Crane did not answer. Sandra looked at Reese. Keep pulling. Every linked schedule. She looked at Terrence. What's your name? Terrence Mack. How long have you been here, Terrence? 4 years. Go nowhere. What followed was not dramatic in the way boardroom scenes looked in movies. It was quiet and relentless and increasingly cold, the way the discovery of something wrong always is when the people discovering it are beginning to understand how long it was hidden. Reese found the second discrepancy inside 20 minutes. A liability figure for the Hargrove pension reserve that had been presented under the distressed column at a value that assumed wind down, despite the pension fund holding a solvency buffer that had been filed with the state of Ohio in August, filed publicly, just not referenced anywhere in Meridian's valuation documents. The third was smaller but structurally significant. A receivables aging schedule that had been presented with a 60-day delinquency assumption when Hargrove's actual collections data showed 38 days average. The difference changed cash flow modeling by enough to matter. Crane challenged each one with the verbal dexterity of someone who had done this before. Technical explanations arrived quickly, fluently, one after another, the way they do when they have been prepared in advance. Conservative modeling, he said, for the receivables. Standard practice in distressed scenarios. Except Hargrove isn't distressed, the younger man said again. His name, Terrence had learned by now, was Fletcher Haas, and he had apparently been sent by the same investment group but was beginning to operate like a separate person. Crane turned toward him with the specific patience of a senior partner addressing a subordinate who had lost the thread. Fletcher did not look away. Terrence watched that exchange from his place near the wall and understood something about it that he could not have explained in financial language. He recognized the moment when a person inside a plan stops believing in the plan. He had seen it before in different rooms, wearing different clothes. Sandra was reading printed sheets now, one after another, passing each to Rebecca Lowell, the hospital's general counsel, who had been called up from the third floor and had arrived in the middle of the pension fund discovery. Rebecca read without speaking. Her expression changed on the third sheet in a way that meant she was beginning to count. "Philip," Sandra finally said, very quietly, "your model assumed distressed asset valuation at 61 cents on the dollar." Crane nodded. Based on a net asset figure that was wrong before you brought it to me." She held up one page. "And I want to understand how a firm with 4 months and a full due diligence team built a valuation on a baseline that excluded a $31 million asset acquisition that was public record." Crane's mouth opened, closed. "An acquisition," Sandra continued, voice dropping lower, which was worse than louder, "that posted 3 weeks before your team submitted their preliminary term sheet." The room found a new kind of silence. Fletcher Haas, across the table, had turned a page in his own folder and was reading something Terrence could not see. Terrence looked at the clock. 7:22 a.m. Josie would be waking up at his sister's apartment in 40 minutes, reaching for the spelling words they hadn't finished. He thought about that for 1 second and then put it away. Rebecca Lowell set down her papers. "Sandra, I need 5 minutes with you, without Meridian in the room." Crane straightened. "That's not how an active negotiation. It's how this one is about to go," Rebecca said. Sandra stood. "Philip Fletcher, give us the room." Crane looked at Terrence once before he left. The look was brief and specific, and Terrence had received versions of it before. It was the look a person gave when they understood something had gone wrong, but hadn't yet decided where to put the anger. Rebecca Lowell waited until the door closed. Then she looked at Sandra and said, "This valuation wasn't incompetent." Sandra was still standing. "Say it clearly. These aren't modeling errors. Conservative assumptions don't move in the same direction every time unless someone is pointing them that way." Rebecca opened her folder. "The Belmore acquisition date is public. The pension solvency filing is public. The receivables data is in our own quarterly report, which Meridian received in August." She closed the folder. They had the right numbers. They chose different ones. The room was very quiet. Terrence said nothing, because it was not his turn to speak, and because what Rebecca was saying was already landing in the space where the morning's slow horror lived. Sandra turned toward the window. Outside, Columbus, Ohio was beginning to come to life in the gray October morning, car headlights still on, the hospital's own parking structure filling floor by floor with people who had come to work, believing the institution they worked for was still the one they had started at. "If we had signed," Sandra said. "Meridian acquires Hargrove at distressed valuation," Rebecca said. 61 cents. They immediately revalue upward against the corrected asset base, refinance the assumed liabilities at better terms, and control a profitable regional hospital network for roughly 40% less than fair market." She paused. "With your signature on the document." Sandra exhaled, slowly, the way you exhale when something you suspected is confirmed. "How many employees?" she said. It wasn't exactly a question. 2,200, Rebecca said. "And the terms allow workforce restructuring at acquirer's discretion within 90 days. No one said anything. Terrence looked at the floor. He was thinking about the radiology team on the second floor who brought in coffee cake every Tuesday, about the woman at the security desk who always asked about Josie by name, about the fact that none of them knew this meeting was happening, and that this morning, none of that had changed because of anything more organized or powerful than a page that slid off a table. "What do we need to stop the signing?" Sandra asked. "Corrected valuation documentation on the record before any transfer of authority." Rebecca was already writing, "And I want forensic eyes on how that model was built. If someone inside our organization provided Meridian with shaped data." "Find out? And Meridian?" Sandra turned from the window. "We give them the chance to correct their own numbers first, and watch what they do with the chance." She looked at Terrence. He had been so still that for a moment she seemed to recalibrate, as if she had briefly forgotten he was there, and was now remembering all at once. "Terrence," she said, "this morning, did you know what you were looking at when you picked up that page?" Terrence considered the question the way he always considered questions that deserved honest answers. I knew the number was wrong, he said. I didn't know why until Reese started pulling the schedules. But you knew it was wrong? Yes. How? He looked at the window for a moment. I worked in hospital finance for 6 years, he said, before. Sandra waited. My wife got sick when my daughter was 2 months old. Treatment ran 14 months. After she died, I had about as much left over as you'd expect. He said it without self-pity, which was the only way he knew how to say it. Lost the position. Did warehouse work for a while. Then this came open and the hours fit around school pickup. The room was very quiet again, but differently than before. Sandra said hospital finance, operations reporting mostly. Some M&A support work in my last 2 years. Rebecca had stopped writing and was simply looking at him. I'm sorry, Sandra said, about your wife. Terrence nodded once. He did not add anything. Philip Crane's correction came at 9:15, presented with the practiced smoothness of a man who had decided that controlled acknowledgement was less damaging than continued resistance. He described the Belmore omission as a documentation lag. He described the pension figure as a conservative floor estimate. He did not describe the receivables assumption at all, and neither Sandra nor Rebecca pressed him on it yet because they were waiting. Fletcher Haas submitted his own revised preliminary figures separately, from his phone, to Rebecca's email, without speaking to Crane about it first. That told Terrence everything he needed to know about the next 48 hours inside Meridian. By 10 a.m., the corrected net asset valuation had raised Hargrove's fair market position by enough that the acquisition conversation had to restart from a different room, metaphorically speaking. The 61-cent offer no longer fit the numbers. Meridian's acquisition team had booked flights home that now needed changing. Sandra convened a smaller session at 10:30. Herself, Rebecca, and Hargrove's CFO, a steady man named Albert Park, who had arrived at 9 and gone pale reading the morning's findings. Terrence was not in that meeting. He had gone back to his cart. He had 3 more floors to do before his shift ended. The building still needed to be clean, whether or not the ownership of it was changing. He was on the 22nd floor, running a mop along the window corridor when his cell phone vibrated. Unknown number, Columbus area code. He answered it. Terrence. Sandra Vaught's voice. Where are you, 22s, he said. Come back up. He arrived on 38 to find the small session still in progress and a 4th chair pulled to the table in a way that communicated intent. Albert Park looked at him over the rim of his glasses with the expression of a man updating something internally. Sandra said, Sit down. He sat. Albert's team is rebuilding the valuation documentation from the original source data, she said. It'll take until tomorrow morning. We've told Meridian the signing is postponed pending full audit review. She set both hands flat on the table. What I want to know is whether you can sit with Albert's team today and flag anything that looks like what you saw this morning. Albert said, without warmth but also without hostility, I'd like to understand your methodology. Terrence said, I don't have a methodology. I look at numbers until something doesn't fit. Albert studied him. That is a methodology. Sandra said, my daughter has a field trip today. Her teachers know. She'll be fine until 4. She stopped. That was about you, not me. I'm saying, your daughter, do you need to be somewhere? He looked at her. Josie was at his sister's until evening. He had nothing until pickup at 6. I can stay, he said. Good. She did not make it sound like charity, which was the only way he could have accepted it. The rest of that day was numbers. Pages and pages of them, filling 3 monitors in Albert Park's office while Terrence sat in a borrowed chair and worked through acquisition schedules the way he used to work through them in a different life, in a different version of himself that he had not visited in almost 5 years. It came back the way things did, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece fitting to the next until the shape of the whole was visible again. 3 more figures surfaced with directional bias, all of them compressed Hargrove's apparent value. All of them in ranges that could be defended individually as professional judgment and couldn't be defended collectively as anything other than intent. Albert documented each one with the precision of someone who understood that this documentation would eventually be read by people whose profession was finding holes in it. At 2:30, Rebecca joined them with news from the forensic review. A data file had been transferred from an internal Hargrove financial share drive to an external address 4 weeks ago. The login used belonged to the former director of strategic planning, a man named Vincent who had resigned in September to join a consulting firm whose most prominent client was Meridian Health Partners. The room went quiet in the particular way it did when something suspected becomes something documented. He had access to our source financials, Albert said, and he had 3 months to help Meridian know which numbers to adjust, Rebecca added. Sandra, standing in the doorway, said nothing for a moment. Then get his personnel file, and get me outside counsel by 4 o'clock. She looked at Terrence. He had not spoken through any of this, only worked, which was the same thing he had been doing on 38 at 6 that morning. She seemed to recognize the pattern. "You were right to knock on that door," she said. Terrence looked at the monitor. "I almost didn't. What stopped you from walking past?" He thought about it. Not the financial logic, which was the easy answers and also the incomplete one. He thought about Josie's spelling words still in his pocket. About how many times he had stood in a hallway knowing something was wrong and told himself it was not his business. "My daughter," he said. "She's 7. She asks me every night what I did at work, and I tell her I made things clean, and that's true. But I thought—" He stopped. Started again. "I thought if this was wrong, and I kept walking, and she asked me that question tonight, I wasn't going to be able to answer it the same way." Rebecca looked at the table. Albert had stopped typing. Sandra said, "Okay, just that, okay." But the way she said it meant more than agreement. The board was convened at 4 o'clock, emergency session, all trustees joining by video from wherever their Tuesdays had taken them. Sandra presented the findings without drama. Albert presented the corrected valuation. Rebecca presented the forensic timeline. Terrence sat outside the boardroom in the chair that Sandra's assistant had placed there, with a cup of coffee and no explanation, and he waited the way he had learned to wait for things he could not control. He texted his sister, running late. "Can you do dinner with Josie?" His sister replied immediately. "She already had me read her spelling words 3 times. She says hi." He smiled at his phone in the empty hallway and then put it away. At 5:48, the boardroom doors opened. Sandra came out first. Behind her, Rebecca was speaking quietly into her phone, and Albert Park was carrying 3 folders that he had not walked in with. Sandra stopped in front of Terrence. "Meridian has withdrawn the offer," she said. "They'll issue a statement about mutual agreement to discontinue." She said the last part with the dry precision of someone who understood how such statements worked. "Vincent's situation has been referred to outside counsel. The board has requested a full independent review of the valuation process." She looked at him steadily. "And I have a question for you." Terrence waited. "Why are you still cleaning floors?" It was the same question, different room, that people sometimes ask with the wrong architecture, as if the question were a compliment and the current answer were something to apologize for. But Sandra asked it the way she asked most things, which was directly and with the expectation of an honest answer. "Because it fit," he said, "after everything. The hours fit, the building was close to Josie's school, and nobody needed me to be more than what I was showing up as." Sandra nodded slowly. "And now Josie's 7, he said, and some things that fit at 2 don't fit at 7. Sandra opened the folder she was carrying. Inside was a printed document, single page, not thick with the weight of complexity. "Director of Financial Operations," she said. "Created this afternoon. Reports to Albert. Hours flexible with school schedule written into the terms." She paused. "Before you answer, I want you to know that Albert didn't fight it." "Didn't fight what?" "The salary." She slid the page toward him. "Or the terms." He looked at the number. He looked at the terms. The school pickup clause was written in plain English in the second paragraph. He did not say yes immediately, because she had not asked him a yes or no question yet. She was still watching him with the patience of someone who had learned that morning that wisdom sometimes arrived in the people everyone had been stepping around. "The pension review," he said. "The results go to every employee, not just leadership." Agreed. "And the receivables team on since 7. They've been running short-staffed since March. Before any strategic planning initiative, that gets fixed." Sandra's mouth moved slightly at the corner. "You've been watching the 7th floor. I've been cleaning it. Those 2 things are apparently the same." She pushed the page a half-inch closer. "Agreed." He picked it up, read it again, folded it once along the natural crease. "I'll need to tell Josie," he said. "Of course. She's going to ask what I do now." "What will you tell her?" He looked out the window at the Columbus skyline, turning copper in the early evening light, the hospital's own floors lit below them, 2,200 people wrapping up their days in a building that would still be theirs tomorrow. "I'll tell her I made sure the numbers were right," he said, "so that everyone else could keep doing their jobs." Sandra looked out the same window. Outside, October had turned the light thin and gold and final, the way it did in Ohio when the season was shifting and you couldn't stop it, but you could at least face it its head on. "That's exactly what you did," she said. "Terrence picked up Josie at his sister's house at 6:15, 17 minutes later than he said," which she noted with the precision of someone who had learned that numbers mattered because she had grown up watching her father treat them that way. She was wearing her backpack even though she was inside, which meant she had been ready for a while. "You're late," she said. "Long day at work," he said, kneeling despite the ache in his shoulders from hours at a desk he wasn't used to anymore. "Did you clean everything?" He looked at her for a moment. 7 years old, her mother's eyes, her father's patience for things that required more than one look. Not exactly, he said. Today I fixed something instead. She considered this with the seriousness she gave to information that was new. Is that better? He zipped her jacket one notch higher against the October air and took her hand, and they walked toward the car. I think so, he said. Yeah, I think so. 3 blocks away, the lights on the 38th floor were still on and would be for some time yet. But the document that had almost changed everything was already in the shredder. And what remained was only the work of building something honest from numbers that now told the truth.